Rise by Teese Snyder. Chapter 28. Undead Rapids. Derek Riggs, California, 2018. The morning sun gleamed through crevices in the canopy overhead, and I stepped carefully through the forest, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of the undead. Every twig and fallen leaf were threats to the quiet I tried to keep while moving. Though in the full week since the infection had struck, I had somehow miraculously managed to move largely unnoticed by the undead I observed along the way, I remained forever wary of their presence, forever paranoid that they might be lurking around every tree and corner, waiting to reach out and grab me. In the 7 days since the infection struck, my nerves had been put to the test, never able to sleep more than 10 or 15 minutes without waking up to check the surrounding area, or dreaming that I had heard an approaching ghoul. But at the very least, in the 7 days since the infection, I had covered the distance I expected to, and had entered the depths of the forest, moving swiftly and quietly through the woods until eventually I would reach the border of Canada. There was, however, another reason besides staying hidden for why I had chosen the path I was currently on, and as I approached a familiar dip in the landscape that climbed to a tight cluster of trees, I sighed in fleeting relief. I had returned to the spot in the forest I was looking for, and as far as I could tell, the area was clear. I removed my bicycle from my shoulder and quickened my pace for the short distance that remained between myself and what I had buried. The trip north I made every year was only possible to complete in a timely and reasonable fashion because of the precautions I had taken to ensure I had ample supplies and sufficient foreknowledge of the terrain. Thus, every 2 years along the way, I would stop at one of my designated resupply caches that I had buried in the forest to replenish and renew the goods I would carry along the way. And each and every time I had done so, what I had buried years before was there years later, deep enough and remote enough that no man or animal would reasonably be able to find it. But as I came to the top of the hill, where a cluster of trees that I had buried a stockpile of supplies in between had been, I stopped cold, and my heart skipped a beat. Below me, a stretch of fallen trees and scattered earth had slid down the length of the hill, a landslide that had spilt the guts of the forest out over 100 meters, including the supply crate I had buried, that would now, undoubtedly, take longer than the 2 minutes I typically allowed myself in order to find and exhume it. I anxiously scanned the trees and hills surrounding me, clenching my jaw in frustration at the compromised position I would be placing myself in by making noise and staying in one place for too long. Unfortunately, I had no choice but to do just that. I rested my bicycle against a nearby tree and detached my backpack, swinging it around and rummaging through its contents to find a flashlight. Then, after removing the charged lithium battery from my bike, I slid it into the side of my helmet and powered up my heads-up display, navigating through the menu to find the homing beacon that I had left inside the missing crate. It was still active about 25 meters away. I picked up my bicycle and refastened my backpack, quickly descending through the unstable dirt and frayed roots that covered the hill. But as my feet slopped through the still wet and unstable earth in between roots, I stopped sharply, hearing the lumbering moans of not one, not a few, but what sounded like a few hundred approaching ghouls. And though I was bewildered that I hadn't noticed such a mob or even heard them moments before, nevertheless I lifted my head and stared behind me, spotting movement along the tree line in the distance, stretching as wide as I could see. I wouldn't have much time, but fortunately, since the ghouls were still nearly 100 meters away, I would, hopefully, be able to retrieve the missing crate. I pulled a folding spade off of my bike and began digging over the spot where the tracking signal had led me to, a mangled heap of dirt and fallen trees. But just as I cleared enough dirt away to see where it was, my hopes of ever retrieving it disappeared. The crate was firmly squished under part of a tree, anchored in place by another and another. It would take me hours to excavate it, and as I listened to the sounds of the approaching horde, I realized I would have no choice but to go on without it. Suddenly, over the growing drone of moans, I heard the shrill sound of a whistle blowing. I cranked my neck back to the movement in the tree line and looked for where the sound was coming from, pulsing high-pitched whistles 3 at a time, over and over again. I frowned and toggled the display in my helmet to infrared, noticing a spot of body heat moving quickly through the forest. I then lifted my hand at the side of my visor and zoomed in, revealing a small figure running full speed across the uneven landscape. Then, as I powered down the infrared display and returned to my normal vision, the hundreds of undead were revealed once more, following behind the small figure that had been emitting the heat signature, that of a still-living, still-breathing person. My mouth drooped open as I stared down the 50-odd meters between myself, the person running, and the horde of undead following behind him. What surprised me most as I zoomed in again, however, was that not only was the person being chased a young boy no more than 10 years old, he was purposefully blowing the whistle, leading the undead where he wanted them to go, like a shepherd and his sheep. I pulled my bicycle up onto my shoulder and stared curiously at the sight before me, just as the boy that I had been watching, who kept a good 30-meter lead on the undead following behind him, noticed me standing where I was. Suddenly he came to a complete stop, stunned as I was to see anyone else this deep in the forest, let alone anyone else who was still alive. His face was dirty and his blonde hair was matted down from sweat and grease. His open mouth sucked in deep breaths, and his big eyes were spread wide from curiosity, apprehension, and surprise, momentarily ignoring the massive swarm of ghouls still slowly clamoring behind him. A rifle was slung across his back, and a machete was tucked into a sheath on his waist. The whistle in his mouth dropped, catching on the string around his neck, and the two of us stood bewildered by one another for a few more seconds. Then, just as I raised my hand in the air and slowly waved to him, the moans of the undead in his pursuit drew our attention back to reality. The boy took a few bold steps forward, coming within 10 meters of me, and sucked in a deep breath. "Run!" he instructed loudly, pulling the whistle back up to his mouth and beginning to blow it again. I frowned sternly, still amazed at the fact that this little kid was deliberately trying to provoke the undead, that he was actually taunting them to follow behind him. But as I opened my mouth to ask him a question, he ran past me, leaping down the hillside with the grace and sure footing of a mountain goat. Who the fuck is this kid? I thought to myself, momentarily watching him run before I turned back around to see the horde of undead were now only 20 or so meters away. I turned one more time to see the boy running quickly through the forest and decided to catch up to him. I jogged quickly after the boy, who, despite his short stature, was surprisingly quick and nimble, continuing to blow his whistle as he ran. My bike jostled on my shoulder, and the bushes and twigs of the forest clanged and scraped against my armor. But just as I came within 10 meters of the kid, the forest began to clear, and I suddenly recognized where he was leading me. The river. My feet landed against the unsteady rocks and chunky sand that stretched along the side of the riverbed, and my eyes gazed in wonder at its uncannily dark red waters. So dark and red, in fact, that it might as well have been a river of blood. I stopped cold in my tracks, staring at the obstacle before us and listening to that damned kid continue to blow his whistle and continue to approach the river, regardless of the hundreds upon hundreds of floating bodies that bobbed on top of the current, caught in the water, being dragged out to sea. And despite the raging, bloody river before us, I knew that the far greater threat were the bodies of the undead trapped in the current, those that didn't have to breathe, those that couldn't swim and had no choice but to ride the length of the river. And without a doubt, the massive numbers of corpses floating on top of the water were almost all certainly the undead, waiting for the opportunity to grab hold of anyone dumb enough to stumble within their reach. And once again, to my surprise, that's exactly where the boy was headed. "Come on!" he shouted, sprinting up a short hill covered in long grass, pausing momentarily to address me, as if he were doing me some kind of favor by telling me what to do. And while I didn't have time to argue with him or let him know that I was the world's foremost ghoul expert and killing machine, the kid happened to be taking the right path and doing something so smart that it had only just moments before occurred to me. He was leading the undead into the river, letting the current sweep them away hundreds at a time in the filthy, bloodied waters. I smiled adoringly, impressed to say the least. I followed after him, reaching the top of the short hill and thrashing aside the tall grass to clear my view, able to see the kid now standing on a flimsy raft connected to a rope strung across the river. But as I moved quickly down the hill, he pushed the raft off the shore with a stick that had been resting on top of it, separating himself from me and leaving me no choice but either stay where I was and be eaten alive, or swim in the river of blood and risk being pulled under by the undead trapped in the current. I stopped smiling. "The raft can't hold us both," the kid shouted, somehow understanding every concern that was going through my head before I bothered to yell at him or ask questions. And from what I could tell, he was actually expecting me to shimmy along one of the ropes stretched taut just about a foot above the length of the river. The only problem was that the armor I was wearing seriously limited my ability to swim. But once again, I had no choice. The crowd of ghouls that the boy had gathered was so large and so dense that I knew I wouldn't be able to ride around them without running the risk of being swallowed up, and so I quickly waded into the bloody water, pulling a release cord on a section above each of my bicycle's tires, which quickly inflated and floated my bike to the surface of the river. Then, with a strap from my backpack, I tethered the bike to me, allowing me to use one hand to hold the rope and the other to hold a knife. By the time I was knee-deep in the water, the undead behind me were already at the top of the short hill, stumbling down towards the shore. I reached behind me, dug my fingers into one of the pouches stitched into the side of my backpack, and pulled another release cord, deploying an air pouch out of my bag designed to assist me if I needed to swim. Unfortunately, even with the assistance the inflated sack would give me, I knew it would be difficult to keep my head above water, holding on to a flimsy rope, hoping I'd be able to dodge the bodies barreling towards me without getting knocked off or snared along the way. Not exactly the ideal situation, and to my surprise, one that I had never even considered before. Yet despite that fact, this time, strangely, I genuinely wanted to meet this fellow survivor, to catch up to the boy that reminded me so much of myself when I was his age. I rushed forward, reached the edge of solid ground beneath my feet, and stepped off, holding onto the rope with one hand and a hunting knife with the other. My bike dangled on the strap, tethering it to me, dragging heavily in the water like a ball and chain. Though it pulled me in the direction of the current, I kept a firm enough grip on the rope that I was able to steadily crawl across it. Bodies of slow-moving ghouls rushed past me, their fingers just grazing my armor or bouncing off my bicycle. The boy continued to pull himself on the raft, using the same safety line that I was in order to reach the other side. The crowd of ghouls that had followed us slowly wandered into the water, only to be scooped up by the current and rushed away with the others that had unknowingly found their way into the river. But just as I reached the halfway point, I felt a sudden tug on the strap that tied me to my bicycle, almost pulling my grip free. I looked down, my arms pulled at length as if caught in some kind of medieval torture device, to see an undead wedged in the handlebars of my bike, slowly raising its rotten, water-soaked flesh to look me in the eyes, reach in my direction, and moan. Its fingers came within inches of me, adjusting itself to try and get closer and closer. But as my attention shifted to the ghoul caught on my bike, I was no longer looking upstream from the river. Suddenly, a corpse slammed against my back and tumbled to my side, knocking one of my hands free of the rope and barreling into the other ghoul still reaching out for me. I bore my teeth and grunted in pain, feeling as if my shoulder were about to dislocate from the pressure. Then, just as the hand that had been knocked free of the rope rose up to cut my bicycle loose and free me of the anchor pulling me to a watery grave, the two mangled ghouls were pulled free of the handlebars and rushed down the river, still reaching out for me. I released my knife, which dangled on a wire around my wrist, and grabbed hold of the rope with both hands, fortunately able to pull myself along the length of the river without another near-death experience. As I approached the shore, I noticed that the boy had dismounted from his raft. This time, he had not taken to running ahead of me. Instead, he waited, taking the liberty of using his machete on the heads of any ghouls that crawled out of the water and onto the shore. Then, when I felt the relieving touch of solid ground beneath my feet, I too removed my blade from my back and chopped the heads off of the few ghouls that could escape the pull of the water and follow us. Then, standing on the shore of the raging, bloody waters, I turned my attention to the boy who, to my surprise, had lowered his blade and raised his rifle, pointing it right at me. "Have you been bitten?" the boy asked, raising his voice as high as he could to be heard over the sound of the nearby waters. I didn't respond at first and stood stunned by his sudden shift in behavior. His eyes were wide open, and there was visible fear on his face. A tear built up inside his eye, and he swallowed a breath before he opened his mouth to speak again. "Did they bite you?" I shook my head and raised my hands to my side to try and let him know that I wasn't a threat. The boy stared at me, paranoid as he should be. The dark, reflective surface of my visor kept him from seeing my eyes, and no doubt he was both curious about and intimidated by the nature of my armor and gear. The rifle he held shook in his hands as he slowly lowered it, deciding to believe that I wasn't infected. Then, adding to a long list of surprises, the boy took a few tearful steps forward and threw his arms around me, hugging me tightly to him and sobbing for whatever comfort my presence had brought. I stood stunned, for the first time since the infection struck, not knowing what to do. But then, logically assessing the nature of the boy's state, I concluded it would be best to reciprocate, despite the fact it would mean temporarily lowering my guard and taking my hands away from a weapon. I placed my arms around the kid's quivering body and hugged gently, unfamiliar with the gesture and yet somehow warmed by the sensation, looking out on the crimson rapids of the Undead River.